And I'd like all of us to believe that it is possible, to take one day at a time. But I also think that we should have a long view. And if you are, well, is it ever possible? Will I ever be a professor? Will I ever be a group leader and so on? It is possible. A lot more women are accomplishing this. And I'm hoping that a lot more women will try, because it is very, very, very possible. And that's what I would tell my youngest.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you are. Welcome to this special podium of the Cameroon Academy of Young Scientists, CAIS, to celebrate International Women's Day 2024. I'm Dr. Lucia Funu, and I'm so delighted to have you joining us for this special and inspiring event. The format of the podium will consist of a one-to-one discussion with our special guest, and you will have the exclusive opportunity to ask her your question. Without further ado, I'm beyond excited to introduce our special guest, the unique, famous, and truly exceptional Prof. Iruka Okeke. Thank you, Prof. Okeke, for gracing us with your presence today.
Thank you for having me, Luria. It's a real honor. Thank you.
Can you please tell us a bit about yourself?
Okay, my name is Iruka Okeke. I'm a professor at the University of Ibadan. Ibadan is Nigeria's first university, and it also has a very large postgraduate program. I'm in the Faculty of Pharmacy, and I'm a microbiologist. I study bacteria. We're particularly interested in the bacteria that cause bloodstream infections and childhood diarrhea. We also support the Nigeria Center for Disease Control in genomic surveillance of antimicrobial resistance. My group is largely comprised of students. I'm very passionate about training. And in addition to doing microbiology research, I also do science and technology studies, understanding how science can be better used in African settings. Finally, I should mention that I'm a Callistus Juma Science Leadership Fellow, supported by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation.
Thank you so much, Prof. Okay, we can see that you're a well-established researcher and well-acknowledged scholar, and we would like to know how or what was the pivotal moment that drove you towards this field of microbiology and genetics?
It was probably very far back. I know that when I was in school, I went to pharmacy school. I have a Bachelor of Pharmacy degree as my first degree. When I was in pharmacy school and I discovered that it was actually possible to have a career in research, this was already something that was of interest to me. At the time, I didn't know it was accessible. I didn't realize that it was something that I could do. But I know having the opportunity to do an undergraduate research project with my supervisor, Professor Adebayo Lamikora, one of my classmates was partnered with me, Folashade Ologunagba. She's still a practicing pharmacist. And we were looking at microbes in toilets in the university campus. And it sounds like such a boring and mundane subject. But the idea that, you could take a sample from a toilet or urinal, put it on McConkey agar, and the next day there will be red colonies growing on it. I mean, for me, that was remarkable. And the fact that we didn't know what these bacteria were, nobody in the world knew what these bacteria were, and it was our job to find out what they were and whether they were resistant to antibiotics. It made me feel very special and privileged. And that was when I started asking the question of, this research careers that our professors have engaged in, could someone like me do something like that? And before then, I had always envisioned myself as working as a pharmacist in a community pharmacy or hospital. But I think that was the point where I started thinking of research as possibly as a career.
Oh, thank you so much. That is so inspiring. And it actually resonates with me and with the story which you share in your book, Divining Without the Seed. I think that was published in 2011. It was really inspiring book, and you mentioned something about a disease, a typhoid fever that you had back in university. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, my final year in university, I was preparing for final year exams. Then university studies used to be very cumulative. So your final year exams meant a lot. We were all working hard, getting sick and so on. And I kept getting sick repeatedly. Really horrible fever, horrible headache. And nobody knew what was wrong with me. I would go to the university health center. They would give me anti-malarial drugs. I would think I have recovered, and then a day later, the headache would come back, the fever would come back. Actually, intermittent fevers are actually a well-known symptom of typhoid, but it wasn't something that was on the radar of my caregivers. For them, a female undergraduate that kept coming back to the health center, if they can't figure out what is wrong with her clinically, the test they wanted to run was a pregnancy test. They didn't really think that it could be an infection. So I actually had this for quite some time until I was visited by my mother, who is a nurse, and she suspected typhoid and had me tested, actually not with the ideal test, with the Vidal test, which showed that, I had elevated titers to typhoid antigens. And then fortunately, I was treated. But if not, there are many more unfortunate individuals in Ibadan where I'm involved in typhoid surveillance, where, if you're not treated, you could end up with more severe manifestations of the disease, including intestinal perforations. So, having that experience early in my life and as a student with access to a university health center, so basically getting some of the best care that was available in Nigeria at the time. And there was very little use of testing. And so later on, when I started thinking about microbiological testing in the context of research that I was doing, I started to ask myself, well, why did the test happen sooner? Why did my mother have to insist I be tested before that happened? You would hope that if someone had a fever, they'd be tested immediately for malaria, which was rare then, now it's quite common. And that if the malaria test was negative, they would be tested for other potential causes of infection, including bacteria.
Thank you so much, Prof. I just shared the link to your book, which is free for those, in Africa, we like free things, which is free and it's something that is really inspiring for any kind of researcher. That is a must-go book. I'm saying that because this book you published in 2011, and you mentioned a story of maybe back 40 years or 30 years maybe. What's happened to you? And me, I relate to what happened to my kids 2 years ago. But imagine this gap still existing in Africa. That means your view were valid back then and are still valued today. And it means we still need to do much more effort to make sure that we are all safe where we are. So I really appreciate that, and I encourage everyone there to read this book because it's a must-go book. Actually, I was not reading at all when I was reading your book. I didn't like book. I read articles, but I don't read book. And don't ask me why, but I don't like read book. But that book, I read it actually on my phone, and I was able to complete it to the end, and I was really inspired. And it helped me to continue and to persevere, and saying that I should continue, right? I shouldn't stop. I should continue because we need more people like you to change the world, actually. And it's really inspiring what you do and what you are continuing doing. And I would like to know now, to transition, your career motivation and experience. How did that evolve across the different stages of your life?
Yeah, thank you for the feedback on the book. And I should just say that, it's actually quite uncommon for a laboratory scientist to write a book for a more general audience. And for me, it was a big decision to decide to take out the time to do that, because I realized that these problems that we have in diagnostics are actually well understood by those of us who are microbiologists. You just mentioned, you see many examples in your own sphere. But a lot of the policy around diagnostics is not driven by microbiologists. And so I really wanted to write something that will be read by people who aren't reading the scientific literature in microbiology and give them some appreciation of what they should be thinking about. So this actually moves into your question of how things have changed across the course of my career. I've always been fascinated by E. coli. I do research because E. coli is a lot of fun. But I think as my career has progressed, I've become more and more interested in making sure that the work that we do actually impacts the lives of people who may not be familiar with the bench research. So this includes other scientists, but it also includes patients and so on. And I'm really a basic scientist. I actually study the genetics of bacteria. So I'm not just working on bacteria, I'm working inside of bacteria. So I think working in Africa really gives you the privilege as a basic scientist to be doing work that is actually relevant to people's lives. I know many basic scientists elsewhere that, their work is so removed from lives in this generation, it could actually impact lives in future generations. But for me, it's actually a privilege to actually see the benefits of what we do playing out in real time as we work. For example, working with NCDC on national surveillance of antimicrobial resistance is something that we do that is very, very rewarding. And working with sentinel sites, hospitals, to try and see how what we know about bacteria can improve how they diagnose disease, I think is a very, very important part of my work now, but was less of that earlier on in my career when I was really just trying to get my foothold in science, learn how protocols work, understand the literature, and so on.
Okay, thank you so much for, again, a lot of head thought that you share. A lot of policy are not driven by microbiology. So you did your work so that in your book, so that people not from the field can understand it and then implement the policy. And you are actually passionate about doing the work that saves life, and you can see the progress, the change every day. And when you were younger, you were learning about doing the right thing in the correct way. And this again drives me to my next question. I'm sure you have a lot of obstacles. You have encountered, I won't say countless, but I know you may count some that are most important to you that you may like to share with us. And I would like to know this obstacle first, and how do you maintain resilience and motivation toward the face of adversity?
So before I talk about any specific obstacles, I think it's very important for me to lay out the fact that I actually had very few obstacles. I was brought up in a middle class household as a young girl. I went to what was then one of the best high schools in Nigeria. I went to Queen's College, Lagos. So I had the privilege of actually having access to a very, very good education. I did my pharmacy school in Obafemi Awolowo University, which is the first pharmacy school in Nigeria. I had a lot of privilege, and I think that did make it easier for me, and also easier to make the choice to go into research. Because when I got my degree, there's a lot of pressure on many of my classmates to start earning a lot of income immediately, because this income was needed to perhaps send younger siblings to school and so on. So luckily for me, my parents could afford to train my younger siblings. So I had the opportunity to decide to be a postgraduate student instead of perhaps a higher earning pharmacist. Now, that being said, a Nigerian girl growing up in the 1980s, what you're really being groomed for is to become someone's wife. It's good grooming to have. I am someone's wife right now. But the focus on that meant that, my aspirations to do research were often not taken seriously, be it by family members or be it by the society in general. Even when I was a PhD student, people would still refer to me as that girl and not think of the things that I was doing as necessarily being essential or important. And more and more pressure as time went on that, why are you in the academy where you cannot be seen? Of course, I'm very visible scientifically, but not very visible socially. And, in your 20s as a young woman in Nigeria in those days, the most important thing was to be visible to people who might marry you. And then getting a master's degree was perceived as something that would deter people from doing that because of the presumption that most men would want to marry a woman who had less education than they did. So, a lot of people were persuading me, first of all, gently, and then more forcefully, that this was not the correct role for me as an individual. In retrospect, this was absolutely the correct role for me. I'm really interested in knowledge and data. I did work as a pharmacist for a while, but I got very bored very rapidly. I think a career spent counseling patients and dispensing tablets, which on its own is a worthwhile career, would have been boring for me. And so it's really nice that I had the privilege to pursue an academic career. But I was persuaded very heavily by a number of people both in my family, in society, among my friends, that this was not right for me. And I didn't really have a lot of the resources to explain that they were wrong. There weren't a lot of role models. There were a few, but there weren't a lot of role models that I could say, well, so-and-so has done this and it worked for her, so it should be able to work for me. So I didn't have a lot of those examples. It was very difficult for me to be able to push back. And in fact, most of my pushbacking was, well, you may be right, but I'd like to try this. So I'd say that was difficult. The other thing that was difficult as a postgraduate student during the structural adjustment program is that there were very few resources for research and research training. So starting off my master's and my PhD, it was very difficult to be able to do good science in a Nigerian university. I was fortunate to be mentored by a mentor that did have extramural funding. I was able to at least buy the consumables and so on that we needed to do the research. But resources were always called into question. And some of getting around that came from being able to get some early career fellowships. I got a predoctoral Fulbright fellowship to do part of my PhD. I also got a fellowship from the international program in the chemical sciences that allowed me to spend 3 months in Uppsala University in Sweden. So those were helpful in terms of overcoming the resource challenges. And then finally, I would say there was a shortage of mentors. When I was an undergraduate student, the universities were thriving. Almost a third of my lecturers left during my undergraduate education. They all migrated to other countries because of the structural adjustment program. And so it became very difficult to find role models and mentors. I'm grateful that my supervisor for both my master's and my PhD, Professor Adebayo Olamikora, stayed because not only was his mentorship required for me to finish my work, but also, as I mentioned, he had the grant that paid for the consumables that did that work. So those are just some
people on the board now on the call, and we have this brain drain that is coming up more and more, and people just want to run away from Africa. And we need to know that it's possible to thrive in Africa, like from role model like you. And it's really important. But before talking about that, I will now move to the inclusion part more specifically, because you talked about all the society. We don't want you to progress in academia and getting masters and PhD. That is really one of the main issues or the main barrier with inclusion of women in science or in the world actually. So what are the most effective strategies for breaking down barriers? Because you have already identified some. What will be the most effective strategy for breaking them down, especially in a traditionally male-dominated field like STEM and in Africa?
Yeah, I think it's important to have some determination, but it's also not fair to ask for that. Sometimes even if you have determination, sometimes expressing some of the things you would want to say is viewed as insubordination, and it can actually backfire. I think one of the things that is often overlooked when we talk about, what does a woman need to progress in her career, we do need many role models, particularly female role models. But the other thing we need male allies. And actually, there are lots of men who are actually really interested in women's careers progressing. There are lots who are not, by the way, but there are some who are. And I think we need to make these male allies more visible so that we can take advantage of them. Some of my greatest, as I mentioned, I did have a shortage of role models. I didn't have none. I did have some female role models who were amazing, but my mentors were all male. And they were very, very supportive of not just me, but of their other female postgraduate students, postdocs, and so on. I mentioned Adebayo Olamikora before at Obafemi Awolowo University. My postdoc mentor, Jim Caper at the University of Maryland, was also phenomenal in supporting all his mentees, both male and female. And I think we really need to, in addition to celebrating female role models and mentors, we really need to celebrate male allies with proven track records, because as long as there is a gender imbalance in science, at least some females are going to have to depend on male mentors. And I mean, in many of the unfortunate stories that have come to light, for example, in the Me Too movement, have shown that not every male supervisor is a male mentor. And I think it's very important for us to identify those that are and say thank you. And also steer female mentees to mentors that we know can help to drive their careers. I think the other thing that's important is to where there are role models, even if the role models are distant, I think they are very, very important. When I moved to the University of Ibadan, one of the reasons why I chose Ibadan was that I recognized a former role model who was now a professor and then became the dean of the Faculty of Pharmacy. And I don't even know whether she remembered me when I was an undergraduate student and she was a postgraduate student. She was in a different department. I just used to look at her from afar and say, well, you know, she's doing this. She's a PhD student. She got married. She had a baby while she was a PhD student. And so it is possible, even though people are telling me that, you know, these two things don't combine, it is possible for these things to combine. So I think sometimes there are role models who may not even know they're role models, who may be so far away, but, you know, we're sort of looking at them from afar. And I'm really grateful for that kind of support as well.
That's so inspiring. Thank you so much, Prof. And you mentioned something that is very specific and new to me, men alert. I know this is correct, and it's something that I've been experiencing recently, that we have men who like encourage female doing career and progressing. And in the call now, we have some male, some you may know, some you don't know, and some are currently leader or researcher, some are young and will be the next leader. What do you want to tell them as a special tips from you?
I think, first of all, that a lot of what you don't see exists is actually possible. You know, very often we're told that, you know, we have to follow a path that somebody else has followed. Just to be aware of the fact that it is possible to do things that haven't been done before in your sphere. And I would actually hope that many who are on the call and many of my own mentees will be brave. Obviously, I mean, you have to think about what's reasonable and what's feasible. But, you know, the generation that comes behind us has to be more successful than our generation for us to be able to succeed in general. So have a little bit of faith in yourself. If you need mentorship, look for it. Don't have one mentor. Some mentorship relationships can break down, but also mentors can have different points of view. And so if you have many mentors, you can actually weigh different types of advice and choose the advice that works for you, essentially. So I would advise all of those things. And then also to say that, you know, it can be difficult sometimes, even just an experiment, you know, getting an experiment to work is often a challenge. I have a colleague who once said that, you know, most of science doesn't work. And so you really have to be passionate about what you do so that when it doesn't work, you don't get too depressed. So I think part of the challenge is figuring out how to get over those hurdles and to envision some of the things that you would think of as lack of success as learning opportunities. If something doesn't work, you learn from it, and then you can use what you've learned to make something to work in the future. And then also to, you know, engage with peers. If you can talk to people who are experiencing some of the things that you are, they can actually provide advice as well. Don't think that all your mentors have to be older than you. I know that when I was a postgraduate student, a lot of the support I got was from other postgraduate students. And if I remind you then that female postgraduate students, there were some who were not very common. So actually many of them were actually male postgraduate students who were actually excellent peers for me. In terms of being able to offer advice and motivation in the course of my career.
So still in the field of inclusion, I've just completed a course where I learned that we are all biased, whether we believe in it or not, or whether we acknowledge it or not. And the unconscious bias is what could prevent us from total inclusion. And I was surprised to know that inclusion or this bias doesn't only affect race or gender, but can also take age, marital status, belief, religious belief, political belief, sexual orientation, and so on. There are so many in bias. So how do you relate to that, and how do you do yourself to mitigate unconscious bias in your daily work as researcher and leader? and in your community as a whole?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think the first time I heard about unconscious bias in the context of, scientific mentorship, I was actually a Black scientist in a predominantly white setting. And I remember being surprised by the idea that I could have unconscious bias. I felt, I'm a victim of racism and sexism and all the isms. Of course, I should be the most inclusive person. And then I sat down and examined myself. I was on a course where we were actually given some questions, and I realized that I too actually do have these implicit biases. And I think the first thing is actually recognizing it. And then recognizing that if you just let your actions be what they are, they may not always be fair. And I think we have to find ways to objectively assess people. Written exams, I really do not like them because they often don't show all the strengths that a particular individual has, but they can often get around unconscious bias. And so thinking about ways that will allow you to assess people irrespective of what biases you have. And then also doing group assessments, having people who are not like you be part of an assessment. For example, if we're hiring someone in my group, sometimes I ask other people to be part of the panel, even though they may not be working in my group. They may not benefit from this hire, but they're more likely to bring a different perspective and a different set of biases from the biases that I have, and hopefully try and neutralize some of the damage that I could do with my own biases. So I think one of the things that we have to do in the academy, and we have to be in a hurry to do, is really to diversify the academy. We all do have our biases, but when it becomes particularly harmful is when many of us have the same biases. And so the more we can try and bring in people who don't look like, act like, have the same backgrounds as we do, the less likely my individual bias is going to have the force that it has when everybody in the academy looks like me. So I think one, first of all, recognizing bias, and two, really pushing for diversity and inclusion so that we can overcome some of the harm that bias actually brings.
How do you navigate the balance between advocating for this change and maintaining your own well-being, increasing your work-life balance?
I don't know. Most people around me would say, and they would be right, that I don't have much of a work-life balance. I do far too much work. More work than is desirable for an average human being. That being said, I actually really enjoy my work. A lot of my work is fun to me. And so the fact that I devote so many hours to work is not necessarily a huge problem. It is a problem, but it's not necessarily a huge problem. So some of the things I have to watch, for example, is being sure that I'm not asking people who are working with me to also fashion their lives like mine. If they belong to a choir or a sports team or something, they should be able to enact that in their lives without my work schedule getting in the way of that. The second thing is the importance of people around you, both inside work and outside work, and being able to listen to them and give them time. As I mentioned, I enjoy my work, so there's a complete danger that I will continue to ignore other people who are in my life to my own benefit. And so thinking about, well, they might not enjoy my work as much as I do is an important thing that helps to actually bring me into other spheres that are important. But if you're going to ask me about work-life balance, I think you're asking the wrong person. It's an area that I myself seek mentorship. Actually, don't devote extra time to their science. They do other things. It helps them to think. And so as we fashion our own careers, it's important to have a life outside of science, to have hobbies, to have relationships, to have things that you give, including your time, to other things. And for me, I'm still learning that. And I hope that younger scientists are learning that at the beginning. As I mentioned earlier, I had to fight to be a scientist. And so, sort of putting time into into science was part of that fight. But I'm hoping that the younger scientists are fighting less to be a scientist and more, fighting to do.
Prof has spoken a bit, but it's fine. We understood your point about the fact that you manage your life, not maybe the way we should model it, but you enjoy it, and you're thinking about managing also more about time and family and relationship, so that they also enjoy being with you, and you as you Iruka, and just not you as Professor Iruka Okeke. So we appreciate that the word that you say, and this sincerity is actually touching us, because some people will also say that I'm working too much. I won't say that I enjoy too much, but I'm trying now to balance a bit, so that I'm not fighting, but I also enjoy what I'm doing and inspiring others to enjoy life, basically. And with that, how we can ensure that diversity and inclusion effort remain sustainable on the long term? How can we do that?
Really good question. I'm not sure I know the answer, because unfortunately for us, diversity and inclusion are still an experiment. I think it's a disgrace that we're still struggling in 2024 just to make sure that, if 50% of the world's population is female, then 50% of scientists should be female as well. So I think the fact that we're still struggling with diversity and inclusion is part of the problem. Diversity begets diversity. When you have a more diverse leadership, then you're more likely to have a more diverse followership. And so I think we really have to work as a matter of urgency to ensure that people who either are finding it difficult to get into the academy, or who are underrepresented in the academy, that we open the doors to them. Sometimes it requires us to just open a door and let someone step in, but sometimes it requires us to step out, go out, hold somebody's hand and bring them in, because sometimes people could come in, but they look in there and they're like, I don't want to be part of that. So I think sometimes we have to extend an invitation to make someone who would normally have pursued another line of work to come and join us in academia to make us better. I think it's something that we really have to work towards objectively. In Africa, we often say, well, we're not dealing with racism, but we're dealing with other types of lack of inclusion. For example, many of us who are in universities have parents that have had tertiary education. It's very important for us to bring in so-called first-generation scholars into the academy, because they bring other ways of thinking. If someone didn't go to a university, it typically does not mean they were not educated. It just means that they were educated in a different sphere. They learned a different body of knowledge that is not inside the academy, and which we need to bring in here because they have ideas that we need. And so I think we really need to think about how to bring people and groups that are not represented. We shouldn't see it as, when we do it, we shouldn't see it as we're doing them a favor, but rather when we bring them in, they are actually doing us a favor by bringing new ways of thinking.
But in another aspect of inclusion, it's about generation. We have several types of generation in humanity. We have Gen Z, baby boomer, millennials, and even generation alpha. How did your mentorship change and evolve over time?
It's an interesting question. I'm not every 20 years changing my mentorship style. Instead, is to mentor people as individuals. There is some collective mentorship that goes on. If I have a large undergraduate class, I am their teacher in that class, and that is collective mentorship. But most of the mentorship relationships that are actually really going to go somewhere in the academy are one-on-one. And so what that means then is that I'm working with each individual as an individual. And that individual brings all their skills, talent, and baggage into that relationship. And so that individual may well be a baby boomer or Gen Z or whatever it is, or the next generation that we haven't seen yet. And it's for me to really think about, well, how can I be useful to this person, and how can the person also be useful to me? Because, by the way, mentorship is always two-way. The people in my generation who are on Twitter, myself included, were usually advised to get on there by somebody in a younger generation. And until Elon Musk broke it, that was a good decision. So I think mentorship can be multi-way. And so I think really responding to people as individuals rather than trying to classify them and say, well, you're part of this generation or part of the people who are from this background, I think has worked for me. Now, that being said, how much has that worked for the mentees? I think it's quite probable all of us who are mentors, we attract certain types of individuals to be our mentees. And some individuals may be repelled by the way we do things. And I suppose that's something that we also want to look at, not so much because we necessarily have to be skilled to help everyone, but because we could learn from some of the repulsion, in terms of things that are good and not good about our mentorship styles.
This particular example of a successful mentor relationship you had, the one that characterized everything in your whole career? That's a tricky question, I know.
Yeah, it's a very tricky one, and I'm a bit hesitant for one reason. I don't yet have a mentee that I have now said, okay, you graduated, I'm no longer mentoring you. Of course, as I mentioned, mentorship is two-way. So I get some mentorship from my mentees, and the mentorship relationship changes over time. But I can't really say, okay, here's an example from a former mentee. That person would still be a mentee, and I'm a bit hesitant sharing their story, even if anonymously. And so it's a little difficult for me to pick an example of somebody that I have mentored. Maybe what I should be doing is pick an example of a mentorship relationship of me with someone who has mentored me, and then any secrets I'm disclosing are mine, and then that is fine. So if I think back to was a postgraduate student, a PhD student, I wrote a lot of fellowship proposals because I realized when I started my PhD that we didn't have the resources to finish it. So I wrote a lot of fellowship proposals, and I remember when the first one came back as a negative, I said, well, that's that. This fellowship proposal thing is something that I cannot do. So I'm just not going to do it. And one of my peers said, oh gosh, this is part of being a PhD student. You just keep writing these things. You don't stop. You learn from the mistakes you made on some of them. Your proposals get better, but it is something that you're supposed to do. And so I went to my supervisor then and I said, well, I just heard from this group, and they said, my proposal wasn't good enough to be funded. Should I now just focus on, my bench work and so on? And so said I should keep applying for fellowships. What do you think? And he actually honestly told me the story of his earlier experience on, first of all, he was very fortunate that the first PhD application that he made was successful. And then he just went on and then did his PhD funded. His first grant proposal was also successful. So he actually learned the opposite from me later on, that, hey, there are proposals that you write that actually are not funded. And so he told me this story, and he said, but that didn't stop me. I then went on to write other proposals, and that these proposals that I then wrote, one of them is the one that you are funded. So if I had stopped with my first rejection, I then would not have got the funding that allowed you to do your PhD. And I think that was actually the sharing of a non-success story was actually very important for me and for motivating me to continue with making these attempts in my own career.
So nice. Learn from your mistake and keep improving yourself to get it well. And now I would like to open the floor to the participants. If they have any question for Prof. Iruka N Okeke, you can ask your question in the chat, or if you have enough bandwidth, you can share it. You can open your mic or raise your hands, and we would like to hear from you.
Okay, there's a comment that maybe I should just respond to about senior colleagues trying to impose their way of doing work on other people. I apologize for all of us that may do this, sometimes unwittingly, but often deliberately. First of all, I think it's very important for us to recognize that the way I work best is not necessarily the way the next person works best. And so when I impose my impossible calendar on someone, I might actually be destroying their productivity instead of the other way around. I was privileged to be in a discussion online with the Microbiology Society and Judith Armitage, who's a retired professor at Oxford. And she said when she was very early in her career, departmental meetings were held on Saturday. And she actually had to ask, well, why does this happen? And she was told that her colleagues said, well, that was when their wives went shopping, and so they had nothing to do, so they had the departmental meeting. So sometimes, very politely, very respectfully, I'd like to suggest that you challenge some of these things. If someone says that, oh, well, the lab meeting will be at 6:00 in the evening, you may then politely say that, well, I'm sorry, the crèche would have closed at that time, and so it's not possible for me to attend because I have a young child in crèche. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's deliberately, we'll have it in the evening just to see who stays long at work, which is a completely wrong way to do this. And sometimes just the person did not think that because they don't have kids in crèche, that some of the people in the group do. And so I'd really encourage us to push back when we can, again, very politely, very carefully, just to get around the inadvertent thing. And then ultimately, we have to challenge the people who are doing it deliberately. And maybe a senior mentor can help with that. Maybe someone can help approach a professor in your department and say, maybe meetings should be scheduled during normal working hours so that things that people have to do outside of work can be done during the hours that you choose to work and others don't.
That's a really amazing advice. Change, you can push back, but doing it politely and respectfully, because some people may not know, while some people may know it, may do it deliberately, and you have to push back because you have to know your right also and stand up for that. You have a question from Justin Zenji. Justin?
Thank you so much. I really appreciate. I was very happy. I'm happy to attend and listen to Prof. A lot of books. I just imagine that, reading is something that can help me, improve what I am today. But I have a question because I'm trying to switch my first field of expertise from plant biotechnologies to science policy aspect. So my question is, how can I be a renowned researcher in another field without following the normal path, like going to do a bachelor degree, a master or a PhD degree? How can I be a renowned in another domain if I don't want to follow the normal path? Thank you.
Okay, it's a good question. I only heard some of it, but I think I heard the essence of it. It's essentially that you're thinking of switching fields and how to maintain yourself as an expert in doing that. So switching fields is hard work, but it's certainly doable. I think the first thing to recognize is that if you are switching fields, the urgent thing to do is to bring yourself up to date on the literature in the new field. Earlier today, I was just talking about what makes you an expert. A good part of what makes you an expert is knowing the field. And when we are postgraduate students, we start our literature review, and then if you stay in that field, then you're just updating it. But if you're entering a new field, you're basically going back to what you did in grad school. Start again with knowing the field. Don't just assume that you can just jump in and move around. You need to actually do your systematic literature review and then know the field. Then also, even if the field is very removed from what you do, there's a good chance that you bring skills to the field that may be underrepresented in that field. I know you said you were coming from plant biotech. I didn't hear where you were going to, unfortunately. But very often there are skills that you can bring from a field that are underrepresented in the new field. So as you read the literature, start to think about whether you could use that to actually carve a niche for yourself in the new field, bring some of the expertise that you have in your previous field to bear on that field. And then the third thing you might want to try and do is to find some collaborators within your new field who can help you with navigating the field, introducing you to people, explaining how certain techniques get done. Sometimes doing a short stint in somebody else's lab is a good way to learn a new field, or in somebody else's group. It's a good way if you're a senior scientist, sometimes taking a sabbatical, a few months of a sabbatical, to go and work as a postdoc in another lab gives you a quick view of what that field looks like. You attend their group meetings, you rapidly become an expert in the new area. I'd actually like to encourage you, now that careers are getting longer, there's a good chance that many of us are going to have to switch fields, perhaps more than once during our academic career.
Thank you very much, Prof, for all you have said and the advice you've given. I continue in that path, wanting more advice. As you transition from a junior researcher to the mid-career and then get into the senior positions, especially as a woman, it comes with several challenges because we have to balance work and life. And sometimes if you want to really become an expert, then maybe life suffers a little bit. How has it been for you, and what advice do you have for all of us listening, especially women, since we are really concentrating on the Women's Week? How do we manage that? Your advice will be very welcome. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for the question. I suppose the first thing to think about is that it's not just women that need to balance life and work, but unfortunately our social structures are such that men often have women helping them balance things, and women are often trying to balance things without help. It's not always the case, but it's sometimes the case. So I think it's just helpful to just remind yourself that the numerous responsibilities that you have are supposed to be shared, even if they're not shared. And then think about how you might help yourself. As I mentioned before, when Luria asked a question about balance, I'm still a student of how to better balance things. I actually actively seek mentorship in that area. But some of the things you might want to think about include the following. First of all, as you get higher up and make a little bit more income, there are certain things that you can actually pay to have done. Even when criticized, I would suggest that you think about what the things you can pay to have done are, and that you pay to have those things done. Now, for you as an individual, you might want to choose what these things actually are. So, for example, I actually enjoy cooking. So as much as I pay to have a lot of things done, I do not employ anybody to help me cook. However, that might be something that you might want to consider. There are people in Nigeria that you can pay to go and shop for you. There are people that you can pay to do your cleaning. So think about devoting some of the resource that you make to paying for some assistance with other things around you. Very often this comes with criticism. Sometimes socially you may be told, oh, well, if you have people cleaning your house, that means that you are not up to the task yourself. I would just ignore that. Okay, I mean, there's all sorts of criticism that people have faced. There have been women who have been told that, if they are really women, they shouldn't go through a cesarean section, and have taken that advice and lost their lives. Okay, so sometimes, you just listen to some of these comments and then you decide, okay, this is real advice and this other thing here is not real advice, and then you just go with it. So if there are things that you can actually, if you have the resources and you can pay for help for, I think you need to consider those things. And then also, if you have the luxury of being able to position yourself better, for example, if you have a mentor that is insisting that you work Saturdays, Sundays, evenings, and you realize that this is not possible with the life that you're living, then maybe it's time to see whether you can find a mentor who understands that, well, you may not be available Saturdays, Sundays, evenings. That may be difficult to navigate for some of us and easier for others. Certainly a thing worth thinking about. I was talking to a young man a while ago and asking him why he never helped his wife in the house. And the reply surprised me. He said, she never asked. And my first thing was that, well, does she have to ask? Can't you see she's sweating and so on? But then it occurred to me that, well, maybe he can't see. And so I'm not saying this is the solution to your problem, but even if you don't have money to buy your way out of certain things, sometimes you might just want to ask. The way we socialize our sons is unfortunate. Sometimes you see people, women even, training their daughters to cook and not their sons. So maybe if you have a spouse who doesn't help around the house, maybe you could just say, well, this evening, I really need to work on my PhD proposal. Would you be willing to feed the kids and put them to bed? And you might be surprised at the answer. The answer might just be, oh, sure, I'll try that. If I have questions, I'll ask you. But sometimes we never ask. And so I would suggest that if you're not going to get help, at least make sure that you've asked for the help first. I think that's something also that we could try. And then finally, if you see other people struggling on something that you could easily solve, maybe we could all help to be our brothers and sisters' keeper by helping with those things occasionally. I have known instances where there are research groups where some of the people in those groups share childcare. So every evening they have a play date in their house where all the kids can play. And then that means that all the other parents of those kids get 4 evenings a week where they can work on their work while their kids are playing in one place. So I think we can think of ways to help each other. So I haven't really answered the question. I don't have a straight answer to the question, but I'm going to ask us to please be as creative in our research, in our personal lives, in terms of being able to get more space and time for each other.
Thank you very much. I think you have provided some really valuable insights that we can work on. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Prof. Iruka. I see the time is running up so quickly. It has been very fast. And before we close, we would like to hear your final words. Wanted to know what lesson I'm sure you have already said it a bit, but we want you to say it again for those who join us during the way. What lesson or advice you will have given to your younger self back in your teenagehood, or your younger self if you were entering the world today in this digital age?
Okay, Luria, first of all, thanks for moderating. These have been some really thoughtful questions. Thank you. And thanks to all of you who joined. I'm really amazed at the audience that we have here and about your questions. I see there's some in the chat that I wasn't able to address. My apologies for that. I think what I would really tell myself earlier on, I mean, when I started research, it was an experiment. I'll just do this and see if I can manage it. And if not, I would drop out. I think I would tell myself that it was possible. And I'd like all of us to believe that it is possible. I think it was helpful for me to take one day at a time. But I also think that we should have a long view. And if you have to ask yourself, well, is it ever possible? Will I ever be a professor? Will I ever be a group leader and so on? It is possible. A lot more women are accomplishing this. And I'm hoping that a lot more women will try, because it is very, very, very possible. And that's what I would tell my youngest.
I can see Mulemba, Linda, Neil, some people in the car, Estos. We are joining from all over Africa, I think. Serene, Estelle. So I just snapshot quickly so that Prof will leave us. And we really appreciate your comment. The discussion was so inspiring. We learned a lot, and I'm sure I'm talking for many women and the male that are also present, that we definitely took some advice that will bring us forward in this world and make us be more confident in how we are navigating first our own career, our family, and also breaking the barriers about diversity and inclusion that led maybe making Africa lagging behind. And we definitely continue action, the tip that you provided to us. And we hope to have you again very, very soon, Prof, because we enjoy discussing with you. And we also would like to acknowledge our vibrant and brilliant community today. Thank you for joining us. It was so nice and amazing to having you here. Thank you all, and we hope to have you back again. That's all for me, and I wish you a lovely day. And again, happy International Women's Day to all. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye. Greetings from DRC,
Goodbye.
Bukavu.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye,
Goodbye.
everyone.
Bye. Bye.